Hey everyone, so we're going to continue on with our implementation of the backend for the backlog and project tasks. And the next step that we're going to take is to actually set the relationships within or between these three objects, okay? So I'm going to start by wiring up the relationship between the project object and also the backlog, all right? So as I mentioned before, each project has one backlog, and a backlog can only belong to one project, okay? There could be a use case where you have a project with different backlogs, but right now this is a tool for personal use, so I'm really not going to get into that, all right? So let's start first updating our project object, okay? For a project object, we're gonna include an additional attribute, which is the backlog. Okay, very simple. Private backlog, which is obviously of type backlog, and we're gonna call it backlog. Cool. All right. So now that we have this, before we forget, let's just do the getters and setters right here. I always do the getters and setters right off the bat because then, I mean, it's easy to forget. It happens. Okay, so for the backlog, we're going to do a one-to-one relationship. One backlog to one project. A project has only one backlog. Okay. Now let's define this relationship a little better. First of all, is the fetch. Okay. For this time, we're going to use eager. That way, when we load a project object, then the backlog information is readily available. The other thing that we're going to set up here is the cascade, and we're going to say cascade all. What this is doing, or in the context that I'm using this, is that the project is the owning side of the relationship. Okay, this is a keyword, the owning side of the relationship, meaning that if I delete the project, then everything that's a child to the project, in this case it's going to be the backlog and obviously the project tasks, then everything should go away. Everything should be deleted whenever I delete a project. But if I delete a backlog, which we're not going to have to, but if I delete anything downstream, it doesn't affect the project. Okay, and this is mapped by project. Now keep this one in mind because this is the same attribute name that we have to give to the project object on the backlog side. Okay. Now I am going to let it happen just so you guys see the importance of it for those of you that don't have experience with this kind of things. But usually when you have a REST API and you have entity relationships like this, it goes into an infinite recursion because it's trying to set the relationship over and over and over again. And we're going to have to do something here, but I'm just going to let it happen so you guys see what the problem is, so you guys know how to identify the problem, and then that you guys understand what to do. Okay, then we're going to go back to the backlog, and on the backlog then we're going to obviously add the relationship with the project. So private project, okay, and very important, this is the attribute name that I'm talking about. That should be exactly one-to-one, like perfectly match this. Okay, it needs to match this to a T. Very important to understand. Okay, because if not, you're gonna have problems with when trying to fire up the server. Okay, again, this one is a one-to-one as well, and this one I am going to also do a fetch of type eager. Okay, sometimes doing eager for experimental stuff like this, it's the way to go. This is not going to be a production application. There's a good use case for lazy, obviously, for lazy loading, which, you know, I don't think we have to discuss, but basically for those of you that don't know, lazy basically doesn't load the relationships unless it is explicitly requested, while eager actually loads them all. Okay, so that's the main reason why you want to use lazy, but also then that takes additional considerations, and I just want to be able to move a little faster than that. Than having to stop for that, okay? Because what we want to do right now is get our app functional, and then we can start, as we go along, making improvements. I'm gonna also declare the join column here, which is name, project ID. Okay, so this is the join column that we're going to use, and it cannot be null. Okay, this is just a good practice. All right, perfect. So now we have set up the relationship between the project and the backlog. And before I forget, I do need the getters and setters for the project object within the backlog. And again, when it comes to JSON, we're gonna have to take care of the infinite recursion at some point, but we're not gonna do that just now. Okay, so now that we have the relationship set up, then the next thing that we need to decide is how are we going to create a backlog item. And this is the reason why I want to do it in this video. It's because it's going to make a lot more sense once we start wiring this up. Okay, so as I mentioned, it is a one-to-one relationship. And the way I want to wire it up is that every time there's a new project created, it creates the backlog automatically for that project. That's the way I want this to work. All right, I don't want to have another way to instantiate a new backlog, nothing like that. I just want the backlog to be a part of the project. Okay, which is pretty much, in my experience, how some of these tools actually work. So now the thing that we need to keep in mind is that whenever we create a new project, it's going to go through this method in the service, but also whenever we update a project, that's going to go through here too. So if we just instantiate a backlog here, if we just instantiate a new backlog every time we create, then this is also going to instantiate a new backlog every time you update. Okay, so you need to be really careful with this. And this is, and I know I said this in the first Java section. This is one thing that we really need to be careful with, because this method here, this save or update, is going to have a ton of logic, because we're using it for the same thing, right? So I think that the way around here, or the way around this, is that if you remember the requirement for us to send a project to be updated, is that you need to pass it the ID. So that means that when a project object is brand new, that we're on the new on the creation of a new one, that means that the ID is going to be null. But then when we are updating, that means that the project ID, by the way, I'm talking about this attribute right here. So that would mean that the project ID is not going to be null, because it's going obviously to contain a value. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to do project.getID, getting the ID of the project that we're trying to persist, and we're going to check if it's null. If it is, if this is true, then we're going to create a new backlog, that new backlog item, and then new backlog. Okay. Now here we're also going to set the relationship. So we're gonna grab that project, we're gonna set the backlog to the new backlog that we have created, and then we're gonna grab the new backlog and set the project that we're trying to create. Okay, we're gonna set the relationship here, and then of course another thing that we need to do is that we need to set the project identifier to be exactly the same as the one that we are persistent with the project. Okay, so basically we need this right here. Okay, perfect. So now with this in place, we should be able to create a new backlog only when there's a new project. Okay, and that way we don't need an API to create a backlog per se, but the backlog just comes hand in hand with the project. Okay, so we're gonna restart our server, and I want you to go and open Postman, please. Postman 2. All right, so our server is running. I am going to also open a browser and navigate to our localhost 8080/h2 console so that we can take a look at the database. And I just want to show you that right now I do not have any projects created, and we're gonna take care of that by using Postman. Remember to keep your collection of API calls so that we can move a little faster. Alright, so I'm just gonna get rid of this. So basically I'm just gonna try and create a new project here, and with this in mind, we're gonna try and create it, and we're getting a bad string. Why is that? It says bad string, so we're probably having a server error here. So let's see what's wrong. And this is what I was talking about. Cannot write JSON infinite recursion. And I just want to show you the error. Okay, so through reference chain, IO intelligence backlog to project, then project to backlog, then backlog to project, then project to backlog. Because remember, the backlog is in reality an object within the project object, right? But it's trying to just recursively set the relationship, right? So for this, in order for us to fix this, we don't need to go to the owning side. We need to go to the child side of the relationship, and then we're gonna add the annotation JSON ignore. That way, this is ignored here on the backlog side, and then it breaks that infinite recursion problem. Okay, so whenever you get an error like this, infinite recursion, go to the child side of the relationship and add JSON ignore. And now with this in place, this should work no problem. Okay, let's just give the server a few seconds, and now if we try again, this should work. All right, let's make sure that we're passing all the required fields, and then send again, and there you have it. It's working. We have our backlog here. This is perfect. Now, what's gonna happen if we try and update the project? Remember, the first requirement for us to update the project is to pass it the ID of an existing one. And by the way, before we even do that, why don't we check the database, see how things are looking in here? Okay. Okay, so let's check the project. That's the project that we just created. Let's check the backlog. And perfect, we have the backlog with the same project identifier as the project we created, and also it's telling you that it's related to the project with the project with ID 1, which is the project that we have here, right? So far so good. All right, now what happens if we try and update this project? And I said test project update. If I do that, it's going to update no problem, but then it's going to pass the backlog as null, because if you see here, everything that we didn't pass as an attribute, then it just gets persisted as null, and so is the backlog. Now, do we need to pass a backlog item here every time? God, no, because remember that we're using this in the context, and if you in the context of we are the React tool and we just want to update the project relevant information, which is these three fields here plus the start date and the end date. Why do we need to pass an entire backlog object, which by the way is going to be ever growing because we're always adding project tasks? So why do we need to do that? I don't think we need to do that. The way that I did this for our main project was to set up the following condition. And I'm pretty sure that there are other ways to go about this, and you're more than welcome to go and try. And I encourage you to go on and try. And if you have a better solution, please tell me about it. But the one that comes to mind is if the project.getID, if the ID coming from the project is not null, okay, that means that we're updating. We're not creating a brand new project. We're updating the project. Then we're gonna set project.setBacklog, and then we're gonna try and find the backlog by the identifier, and then actually set that backlog back into the project object so that this is not null. Okay, so that we just fetch whatever backlog was originally created with this. Okay. Okay, so what we need to do here to make this happen? Well, first we need to be able to locate the backlog by the project identifier, all right, or by this parameter here, yeah, project identifier. So for this, we go to a repository, and we're going to use the power of JPA, which allows us to set up somewhat custom queries other than the ones that the CRUD repository has out of the box. So what we want to have is, we want to return a backlog, and again, we're on the backlog repository, and you have the option to find by attributes, okay? And in our case, we're gonna find by the project identifier, which comes here in the IntelliSense of the IDE. And by the way, if you're on Eclipse or STS, you should get the same functionality. And you know, it allows you to find by a specific attribute. In this case, it's the string of an identifier. Perfect. So now with this in place, the next thing that we want to do is to auto-wire that backlog repository onto our service. Awesome. And now, since we know that this returns a backlog object, then all we need to do is that we want to set the backlog to the backlog repository find by identifier to whatever we find with that identifier that comes with the project. Okay, so basically the code is going to perhaps look something like this. It's basically this exact code here. All right. And you know what? This has been used repetitive. Like we have used this 3 times already. We've been repeating ourselves. So perhaps this might be a good time to extract this onto a string, actually, so that it looks a little cleaner, right? So that's a very valid refactor that you guys could do on your own. I'm just gonna get it there, or keep it there, for you guys to take on the challenge and clean it up on your own. All right. Okay, so with that in place, we have already restarted our server, so we don't have any data, so we can pass this one again. We can create this one again, even though, remember, this one has to be unique. So we can create it here, okay, and it has the backlog right there. And then if we pass it the ID to perform an update, and then why don't we just say update it again, then if everything's working, we should get the backlog here. We shouldn't get the backlog null. And perfect. Everything was updated again, and the backlog is not null. Okay? So perfect. We worked on setting the relationship between the project and the backlog, and then obviously we managed our use case, which is to create a new backlog with every new project. And we also managed the use case in which, if the project is coming in for maintenance, if the project wants to be updated, then we don't set our backlog to null, but we actually set the backlog back to where it was. Okay, I'm pretty sure, again, there are better ways. I'm pretty sure there are better ways of doing this, but remember, a rule of thumb in software development is that you get your code to work, and once it works, then you can start refactoring to make your code better. All right. But for now, we're just going to take the working code, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you for joining.